Welcome to the 193rd episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Alex Marwood, author of The Wicked Girls and The Killer Next Door. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Alex Marwood, author of two well-reviewed suspense novels, The Killer Next Door and The Wicked Girls. Stephen King wrote, if you read Alex Marwood's The Wicked Girls, her new one, The Killer Next Door, is even better. Scary as hell, great characters. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there, Jeff.
Great. Well, can I have you read from your novel, The Killer Next Door?
Absolutely, yes. That would be lovely. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to read today is basically the second chapter rather than the opening of the book, which is where you first meet. I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to cough. I have a nasty cold. Which is where you meet the serial killer for the first time. The book has a few scenes from his point of view scattered throughout it. So here we go. He's a magnificent cat, rangy and black and swaggering, with great vampire incisors that extend most of the way to his jawline, green eyes and a kinked tail that speak of oriental blood, and a scarred left ear that shows that he's not afraid to fight. Today, he's asserting his mastery of his territory by visiting. He's been attached to the house for so long that no one remembers who originally brought him here, or if indeed anybody did. Some tenants shoo him away with angry hisses, afraid of his panther grace and unblinking stare. Some sweep him into their arms with coos and growls of admiration, give him a warm place to sleep, and weep when they, as they all do, have to leave him behind. 26 tenants have passed through the house on Beulah Grove since he took up residence, and he's never gone hungry enough to move on himself. He has had many names, and for now it's Psycho. He stands in the window. The lover has thrown it wide because the heat inside is so stifling he's afraid he'll make the air damp with his sweat, and surveys the space, then leaps onto the back of the chair where the girl sits. He leans forward and sniffs her ginger hair, touches an ear with his fine damp nose. Affronted by her failure to respond, he raises his face and looks up at the man. Blinks. The lover is weeping. He sits in a folded chair against the far wall, his face buried in his hands, and rocks. The tears come more quickly every time. He used to have a few hours, even a day or two, in which to savour the company, enjoy the romance before the despair overtook him, to hold the hand and stroke the cheek and take pleasure in togetherness. But each event seems less delightful than the last, seems to pass so quickly that almost as soon as it's done, the yearning begins again, the loneliness breaking over his head like a wave. He's apologizing, as he always does. I'm sorry, he says, and the words catch salty in his throat. Oh, Nicky, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. She doesn't reply. Stares vacant past his shoulder, her mouth half open, surprised. You just, he says, I was afraid you were going to go away again. I can't bear it, you see, can't bear it. I'm so alone. He continues to weep. He's consumed with self-pity, eaten up with the emptiness of his own existence. My life is full of busy work, he thinks. I do and I act and I help and I organize. And at the end of the day, it's always the same. Just me. Me alone and the world going on as though I had never existed. They wouldn't notice, none of them, for months if I disappeared. Families like mine, no money, fractured marriages, siblings only half related, and homes already full to bursting. We drift apart when someone goes away. I don't speak to my half-brothers or sisters from one year's end to the next, just bump into them sometimes when I make the trip back at Christmas. Worst of all, my mother always sounds surprised to hear my voice on the phone. So she hears it regular as clockwork, first Sunday of every month, while Songs of Praise is on. They wouldn't notice. Nobody would notice. I could vanish in a puff of smoke and make a nasty cleaning up job for someone further down the line. He raises his eyes and looks at Nicky, the source of his suffering. A pretty girl, not spectacular, not anything that anyone would say was out of his league, though he supposes that eyebrows might be raised at the difference in their ages. It was all I ever wanted, he thinks. A nice girl. No great ambition, no overwhelming passion like they play out in the movies. No champagne and roses, just someone to stay with me. Someone who wouldn't go away. The cat is standing by the wardrobe now, sniffing at the crack between the doors. The lover leaps to his feet and shoos it off, claps his hands and hisses so that it tenses, and then with a baleful yowl jumps onto the bed and out of the window.
Wonderful.
He considers... Yeah, sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
That'll do. Yep.
Did I interrupt you, or were you finished?
Yeah, sorry, I was just... There's a little bit more, but okay. I don't know. Is that long enough?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Why don't you finish?
Okay, cool. Okay. He considers closing it to keep the cat out, but in this heat, his dwelling space has become stifling, and he's afraid that the smells it draws out will spread through the house. He wipes his salty face on his sleeve and tries to pull himself together. We can have a nice evening at least, he thinks, as he looks back at his silent companion. I'll have a glass of wine, hold her hand. Maybe she'd like to watch a film with me before we begin. Her right hand, knocked by the cat's passing, slips suddenly from the arm of the chair and hangs in mid-air, still and soft. Such a pretty hand, he thinks. The nails are always clean and scrupulously shaped. I noticed that about her the first time I saw her. Always wanted to take it in my own, to press its smooth skin between my palms. No time like the present. He fetches the fold-up chair and places it beside the armchair. Funny, he thinks, she looks smaller than she used to, more fragile, more frail, more like someone who needs my protection. He puts the forearm back along the chair's arm and goes to the kitchen drawer to fetch the scissors. Cuts very slowly, very carefully through the duct tape around the neck, then lifts the plastic bag it holds there, thick, heavy and transparent, from her head, carefully so as not to mess up her lovely hair. He'll give her a bath later. Strip off her stained clothing and run it through the washing machine, shampoo her sweaty locks and comb them down, dust her with baby powder. In heat like this, it'll all be dry in no time. There, he says kindly, and plants a loving kiss on her temple where no pulse beats anymore. He takes his seat and lifts the hand just briefly to his lips. There, he says again, and enfolds it between his own larger, rougher palms, as he's always imagined. This is nice, isn't it? He asks, rhetorically. Okay, that is it.
That's great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your new novel, The Killer Next Door, yet, how would you describe the novel? I suppose you would say that it was psychological suspense. It's very, very loosely based. It's partly my love letter to London, where I live, which I absolutely adore. But it's very, very loosely based on the activities of a serial killer who was working the streets of London in the early 1980s. Who was a chap called Dennis Nilsson, who managed to kill upwards of 12 young men. They've never actually found out how many, but it was at least 12, and dispose of their bodies while living in a shared house with a number of other people in a rooming house. And I think the question that sort of always goes through all Londoners' minds is, how on earth did the other people living in this house not notice? I'm sort of that's really what I'm sort of exploring in this book is what on earth was going on with the other people in the house while Dennis Nilsson was doing his killings. And was that a case that you had kind of in your mind and that you had known about when you wanted to start writing?
I think all Londoners are absolutely fascinated by that case because excuse me, we're also aware of how much we live on top of each other and how it's a very crowded city. I mean it's not tall like a lot of American cities, but it is very crowded. I have 8 flats that are contiguous with mine in one way or another, and really how we all manage to live so crowded together, I think, is by according each other the politeness of pretending that our neighbours don't exist most of the time. And it's not standoffishness, it's actually a sort of a form of courtesy. that is how we contrive to live in London, and that is also how these terrible things manage to happen without without anybody actually picking up on them.
And how do you think that happened in the real life case? Do you think that people were just kind of oblivious in some ways?
Yes, I mean, I think as I said, I think people are sort of, there is a sort of strange London thing of just pretending you haven't noticed stuff going on. I mean, I'm sure at least one of my neighbours can probably hear me giving this having this conversation with you now, but they're blurring it out, But I know a great deal more about, my neighbours' sex lives and things than I would like to. But we all have to greet each other in the street pleasantly in the morning. And so we all just, manage to remove evidence of anything that might disturb us from our minds, I think.
Sure. Well, had you written fiction before you wrote your first novel, The Wicked Girls?
Yes, I used to write under my own name, which is Serena McAfee. I started my career as a journalist. I worked for The Independent, which is a national newspaper in the UK, for about 15 years, I suppose. And then in 1999, I wrote my first novel, which was called The Temp, which was sort of chick lit, as they call it. It was certainly packaged as chick lit.
Sure.
And I was writing very dark, very dark romantic comedies. It got a bit difficult, really, with because my packaging, my basically Random House got a bit disappointed with how dark my stuff was compared with the packaging they wanted to give it. So I decided that the easiest thing to do, to be honest, would be just to change my name and get rid of the romantic element and keep the darkness and the comedy.
Sure. Well, what was the shift like when you went from writing nonfiction for The Independent to writing that first novel, The Temp? Do you remember?
Well, it was extraordinary. They are two very different skills, and it was quite terrifying writing the first one. In fact, the first one came out of the bare bones of it existed already, because I'd been writing it as a column for some time for The Independent. Anonymously, I was sort of zhuzhing up the secretarial pages, where there used to be secretarial pages in newspapers in those days, with this sort of comic office anthropology column, where I was a temp secretary, and so every time, and I'd sort of do the anthropological, inner workings of human beings in offices, and every time I got bored with one set of people, I could just, get another job and move on. So I had the bare bones there, but then yes, it was quite terrifying, actually, suddenly finding myself going from writing, 1,000 words in a row and being very familiar and comfortable with that shape, to suddenly having to do 120,000. And it was the most fantastic thing. But it was absolutely terrifying. I really don't think I slept properly while I was writing my first two books, until I sort of got to understand how it's done. I now, funnily enough, find writing journalism terribly difficult because of the sort of lack of freedom in terms of being able to pursue things that have interested one further. The sort of succinctness of journalism is an extraordinary skill, and I'm rather afraid that I've sort of lost it now.
So what did you think when you first read Stephen King's blurb for The Killer Next Door?
I pretty much screamed out loud, basically. It was just extraordinary. When the Wicked Girls, he is a obviously, I mean, it's just, he has always been my great writing hero. So, on a personal level, just my sort of utter admiration of him, and the sort of the extraordinary humanity that's at the core of his work, and his wonderful use of language, have always been a great inspiration as far as I'm concerned. So, getting praise from Stephen King is sort of like getting a thumbs up from God, as far as I'm concerned. So I was just, really speechless with joy and astonishment.
That's great. Well, given that you have written your chick lit novels and now the two psychological suspense
Yeah.
novels, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who may be wanting to write their own novels?
Well, I think the first most important thing is just that the difference between 90% of the difference between a writer and somebody who wants to write is that a writer actually finishes what they're doing, and actually gets to the end. And that is actually, I know that sounds sort of rather odd, but most people do. I mean, certainly I absolutely lose faith halfway through anything that I'm writing, and start going. And actually, the beginning I find pretty daunting as well. I always start questioning what on earth made me think that I was fit to write a novel and capable of doing it, and forcing your way through that. Is really, is 90% of the battle, really. Don't expect it to happen quickly. It takes me at least a year to write a novel, usually the best part of 2. So, it can become terribly, demoralizing and stressful, but you just have to understand that is the process and that is how long it takes. The other thing is, accept and be grateful for editing. I think a lot of people. I mean, I certainly I found being edited with my first book a very difficult and painful process, because one just finds it so hard to accept, even though I'd had 15 years as a journalist where nobody even asked you and they changed their stuff; they just did it. It's still remarkably painful to accept that what you have produced is not perfect, but it's actually the most important thing you can do of all, and you should be jolly grateful for it that somebody is prepared to do that. I think the other thing I would say is that I don't show my work in progress to anybody, and the first people that see my work in progress will be my editor and my agent. I think that there are a lot of with all the will in the world, your friends will tell you that it's marvelous, because they're kind and they like you and they want you to be happy. And, your peers will not, people at writing groups, I have generally found that there will always be at least one person in a writing group who feels themselves to be in competition with everybody else. And people can quite often get their, self-confidence quite battered by those sorts of situations. So really, don't. My rule is never to show anything to anybody who doesn't have a vested interest in a vested financial interest in it, basically. And the other thing is Stephen King's great thing, which is go through your manuscript and get rid of all your adverbs.
That's great. Well, are there any classic suspense writers that you study or that inspire you when you're in the middle of that novel and you're struggling?
I read a lot more non-fiction when I'm writing. I find that on the whole, I find that actually reading other people's fiction writing tends to put me off my stride. That said, I've just gone back. Actually, I'm having great difficulty with the timeline with the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is as both of my other books are on 2 timelines, but it's a much more complicated timeline structure. This, and I've been having great difficulty. So I went back and reread Barbara Vine's wonderful book, A Fatal Inversion, which was I think it's about the late 80s. It was written in, and I think it was fairly much the first psychological suspense novel that I remember reading, and I remember reading it and just going, "Oh my God, this is what I want to be doing. This is what I want to write for a living." And her, but I was very much reading it for structural stuff rather than for just for just reading. So I was sort of reading it like a sort of work thing in a way, rather than reading for inspiration as such. And it is still just the most extraordinary book. It's brilliant in every way, and she breaks a million rules, all of the things that they tell you shouldn't do, like having more than one point of view in a chapter and more than one timeline in a chapter, and this sort of stuff she does right the way through, and she does it with such exquisite professionalism that I am still completely in awe of that book. I love, in terms of people I sort of read when I'm sort of trying to get started or trying to sort of work myself up to wanting to write again. I love Jeff Lindsay's Dexter books. The Patricia Highsmith's, the Ripley books are just extraordinary. And I read a lot of Stephen King.
Great. Well, do you want to talk at all about the novel that you're working on now, or do you want to wait?
Very, very loosely, it is basically about. The working title is The Long Weekend, and it's about a bunch of people who get together for a long weekend, obviously in a big house to celebrate somebody's milestone birthday. And something terrible happens over the course of that weekend, and then basically what happens to them over the 12 years since. And so it's about secrets, people keeping secrets, and the ramifications of doing so.
That's great. Well, we'll look for that. Again, we've been speaking with Alex Marwood, author of The Killer Next Door and The Wicked Girls. Both novels are in bookstores now, so go grab a copy. And Alex, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you so much for asking me.
The sounds of the holidays are in the air. Jingle bells, wrapping paper, maybe some ho-ho-hos. But at the Home Depot, we also love the sounds of you making the holiday magic happen. Things like ovens baking, turkeys roasting, drinks chilling, air fryers frying, washing machines washing, and your family in the middle of it all. Right now, it's the best time to save on the appliances you need to make the holidays yours. The Home Depot, how doers get more done.
The stockings are hung and the shopping has begun. This holiday season, shop Cincinnati favorite gift cards at Kroger. Grab a gift card to La Rosa's and enjoy a warm slice of pizza. Or snag a gift card to Grater's and treat yourself to something sweet. Whoever you're shopping for, you'll earn 4 times fuel points on Cincinnati favorite gift cards. Head over to giftcards.kroger.com/Cincinnati-favorites to complete your shopping list and support our local businesses. Available in Cincinnati, Columbus, and Louisville markets only. Restrictions apply. See website for details.